Would you believe a dog could uncover a decades-old mystery beneath a daycare classroom without ever speaking a word, just by following a scent that no one else could detect, a feeling no human could explain, and an instinct that led him to scratch the floor until the truth came rising out like smoke from the past? Because that's exactly what happened one rainy Tuesday morning. When a retired police K-9 named Shadow walked into a brightly painted preschool where colorful mats covered the floor and laughter bounced off the walls like music, where tiny chairs and snack tables sat under hand-drawn rainbows and construction paper suns, where no one expected anything to go wrong, especially not Marlene Thomas, the 42-year-old head teacher who had run Happy Steps Daycare for nearly a decade, a woman who wore her hair in a messy bun and kept extra applesauce pouches in her apron for anyone who needed a snack, a woman who treated each child like they were her own, especially after her own son had grown up and moved across the country, leaving her with a quiet apartment and a heart that often reached for little hands to hold. And on that morning, she was just doing what she always did, kneeling to help 5-year-old Noah with his Velcro shoes while in the background, the hum of story time blended with the occasional crash of toy bins, and the air smelled faintly of crayons, sanitizer, and cinnamon from the oatmeal breakfast they had just finished. And outside, the drizzle of rain tapped softly against the window panes like a lullaby when the door opened and in walked Officer James Fulton. Tall, gentle, and widely respected in town, not just for his badge, but for the way he never passed a child without a kind word or a high five, and beside him trotted Shadow, his old partner. A German shepherd with eyes full of intelligence and a coat that had grayed slightly around the muzzle. His movements calm but alert, his tongue hanging out in a relaxed pant as he scanned the room like a soldier returning to familiar terrain. Because although Shadow had been officially retired from active duty 6 months ago, today was a special visit, a community outreach day, part of a program to help children learn about safety and build trust with officers and their dogs. And as Marlene clapped her hands and the children circled around in excitement, Shadow sat obediently at James's side, waiting patiently as kids approached one by one, giggling as they touched his fur and asked questions about police work and chew toys. And James, ever the storyteller, told them about the time Shadow sniffed out a missing girl in the woods, or helped locate a man who had wandered away from a care facility, and the room filled with awe and wonder until something shifted, something subtle, something no one noticed right away except Shadow, who stood up suddenly and tilted his head toward the far end of the room near the reading nook, where foam puzzle mats covered the floor in cheerful shades of red, blue, and green. And for a moment, he froze, ears perked, nose twitching, tail stiff like an arrow, and then he moved slowly at first, walking with deliberate steps to the corner, ignoring the children now, ignoring the voices calling his name, ignoring even James's low whistle, because something had captured his attention in a way that didn't make sense. Not yet, not in a place like this. And as Marlene watched, puzzled, Shadow began to circle that one small area of the room, sniffing the floor, then tapping it once with his paw, then again, each tap firmer, until he began to scratch gently at first, then more insistently, pawing at the foam mat like he was trying to dig through it. And James stepped forward quickly, placing a hand on Shadow's collar and saying his name in a steady voice, but the dog wouldn't stop. His body tense now, breathing heavier, his focus unbreakable, and the children had fallen silent, their curious eyes wide with questions, while Marlene knelt beside the spot, lifting the corner of the mat to reveal the wooden floor beneath it, where a single, faint, almost imperceptible seam ran across the grain, barely noticeable, like a forgotten scar. And James leaned down beside her, tracing his fingers along the line, then pressing slightly, feeling the give beneath his palm. And suddenly the room didn't feel so warm anymore, because something was definitely there, something hidden, something meant to stay hidden. And Shadow stood beside them, not barking, not pacing, just watching, waiting, his chest rising and falling with quiet urgency. And that's when James made the call, stepping into the hallway to contact the department, while Marlene gathered the children and moved them calmly to the next room, trying to keep her voice light, as her heart pounded with a rhythm that told her This was no ordinary day. This was the kind of day people remembered. It's the kind that made headlines and whispered conversations at grocery store lines, and as the rain continued to fall outside, and parents' cars splashed past the sidewalk unaware. The town of Maple Glen was about to have its peace cracked open by the claws of a retired hero who didn't know how to stop doing what he was born to do. It's 'cause some dogs never retire, not in their hearts, not when there's still truth to uncover and people to protect. And if you've ever had a dog like that, one who saw what you couldn't, felt what you ignored, stayed close when no one else did, and then you already understand what Shadow knew, what he sensed beneath the quiet floorboards of a room filled with children's laughter. And you might want to stick around, because what happens next is going to shake this little town in ways no one saw coming. All because of a dog who wouldn't stop scratching. And while you're here, where are you watching from, and what time? Is it right now? We'd love to know who's joining us for this incredible journey, because this is just the beginning, and you won't believe what Shadow uncovers next. The moment the first responders arrived, the air in the daycare shifted from warm curiosity to quiet tension. It's not panic, not fear, just that hushed uncertainty that settles over a place when something bigger than anyone expected begins to unfold. And outside, the steady drizzle continued as flashing lights cast red and blue patterns across the front windows of Happy Steps Daycare. And inside, Marlene stood beside Officer James, arms folded tight against her chest, watching as two uniformed officers gently peeled back the colorful mats that had once been the foundation of laughter. Story time and building blocks only now. They revealed something different, something older. The seam in the floor, now more pronounced as the mats were lifted. The wood underneath worn and dulled with time. And when one officer placed both hands flat against the surface and pressed down with weight and purpose, there was a click, not loud, not theatrical, just a muted mechanical shift, like something tired of being silent had finally allowed itself to be heard. And slowly, the board lifted, not smoothly but with resistance, creaking at the hinges, exposing a narrow gap of darkness beneath the floor. And as the board was pulled fully open, everyone leaned in without speaking, their eyes drawn to the black void beneath the classroom like moths to a mystery. And James knelt down and shone his flashlight inside, the beam cutting through dust and cobwebs, revealing a wooden ladder that descended maybe 8 or 10 feet, with rough walls that had clearly been dug out long ago and reinforced with aged planks. And beside him, Shadow sat silently, watching the beam of light disappear into the darkness. Not barking, not whining, just observing with a quiet kind of urgency, like he had seen things like this before and knew this wasn't just a hole in the floor. It was a story waiting to be told, and James radioed in for permission to descend, knowing that it was technically outside the scope of a school visit, but something inside him, the part that trusted his dog more than he trusted most people, told him this wasn't just some old crawl space or utility hatch. And when he was cleared to go, he handed Marlene his phone and reassured her that everything would be fine. Those eyes carried the weight of something he couldn't yet explain, and slowly he lowered himself down the ladder, boots hitting the dirt floor with a crunch that echoed up into the classroom. And as his flashlight moved across the space, what he saw was strange, not terrifying, not dangerous, just out of place, a narrow chamber maybe the size of a small bedroom, with wood-paneled walls on one side and brick on the other, as though two different people had started building something here and then abandoned it midway. And in the corner, covered in layers of dust, sat a small metal file cabinet, its top drawer slightly ajar, and beside it, an old rocking horse, the paint chipped, its eyes scratched away. And along one wall, faded wallpaper clung desperately to cracked plaster. A pattern of yellow stars on a pale blue background, and James stood there, silent, flashlight trembling just slightly in his grip, because this wasn't just a space. This was a room, a hidden room under a daycare, and it had once been made to look like a place for children. And as he radioed back what he was seeing, Shadow remained upstairs, pacing now. Not frantic but purposeful, his nails tapping softly against the wooden floor, pausing to sniff near. The edge of the hatch, ears twitching at every sound, and upstairs, Marlene had moved the children again, this time to the small play yard out back, her co-teachers distracting them with chalk and bubble wands. trying to keep things light, though Marlene's thoughts kept drifting downward, toward James and Shadow and the space she had never known existed under the feet of children she loved, like her own. And when James emerged again, his face was pale, not from fear, but from something heavier, the weight of implication. Because the room hadn't just been forgotten. It had been hidden, the way secrets are tucked away when no one wants them found. And later that evening, when the local news trucks rolled up, and curious neighbors stood behind yellow tape murmuring theories, the story hadn't even begun to unfold yet, not really. Because what made this story unforgettable wasn't what was under the floor. It was how it got there, who built it, and why it had stayed silent all these years. Waiting for a dog, of all things, to feel what no one else could. And Shadow, now back in the squad car beside James, panted gently, as if it had been just another day on duty, his eyes scanning the sidewalk like he was still on alert, because in many ways he was. Because that room, that hidden chamber, was only the first clue in something bigger. And Shadow wasn't done, not even close. And if you've ever looked into a dog's eyes and felt like they knew more than you did, like they were trying to tell you something without making a sound, then you'll understand what happens next, and you'll want to stay with us, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Not the officers, not the teachers, not even the town itself. And while we piece it together, tell us, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it over there? We love knowing how far these stories travel, especially ones that begin with something as pure as a dog scratching the floor to protect the children above it. Asterisk. It had been 3 days since the hidden chamber was discovered under Happy Steps Daycare. And though the local authorities tried to keep things quiet, word spread fast in a town like Maple Glen, where people still greeted each other by name, the grocery store, and where every quiet street carried the memory of generations past. And now those same streets buzzed with speculation, with murmurs of what might have been, what could have happened, and what was still unknown. Because while the chamber was old and empty, it felt like a question left unanswered. And that kind of silence doesn't sit well with people, especially not with Officer James Fulton, who had barely slept since climbing back out of that dark space, and definitely not with Shadow, who had since refused to eat his full meals, pacing more often, staring at corners of rooms with his ears cocked to sounds no one else heard, because something about that place had stirred something deep in him, and even James has experienced. And level-headed as he was, had started to trust that maybe, just maybe, Shadow wasn't done yet. And so on that Friday morning, with the town waking under a soft blanket of fog, James clipped the leash to Shadow's vest and returned to the daycare alone, walking through the back entrance where Marlene was waiting with a nervous smile, holding a travel mug of coffee and a look in her eyes that said she hadn't slept much either. And together, they stepped into the classroom again, now cleared of mats, children, and toys, leaving only polished floors and faint tape outlines, where reading corners used to be. And as soon as Shadow entered, he paused at the threshold, nose lifting slightly, tail low and still, then began to move, slow and deliberate, not toward the hatch this time, but toward the far wall where a bookshelf had once stood. And James followed closely, trusting every step, watching as Shadow sniffed the air, then lowered his head to the floor, moving along the baseboard until he reached the corner, where he stopped and sat down, not whining, not scratching, just waiting. And when James knelt beside him and ran his hand along the floor, he felt nothing unusual. But Shadow's eyes stayed locked on that corner, like it was trying to whisper a memory too old to speak aloud. And then Marlene gasped quietly, her hand covering her mouth, and James turned to see her staring at the wall with wide eyes, explaining, in a trembling voice, that years ago, before she had bought the daycare, this used to be a small private home. And that corner had once held a door, a narrow one, almost like a closet, but when she moved in, the space had already been sealed off. Drywall painted over, bookshelves built in front of it like it had never existed. And now, standing here with Shadow, refusing to look away from it, the memory returned like a whisper from a life she didn't know she remembered. And James rose slowly, placing a hand against the wall, knocking softly until he heard it, that hollow thump, not solid, like the rest, but echoing slightly. Like the space behind it was waiting, and within hours the team returned, carefully removing the plaster to reveal a narrow hallway behind the wall, dark and dusty, leading not deeper underground but across the foundation toward what was once an attached garage, now converted into a storage room filled with paint cans, tricycles, and old curriculum binders. And as they cleared the hallway, Shadow moved ahead. His pace quicker now, more urgent, as though the closer he got, the more certain he became. And when they entered the storage room, James noticed something, a low humming sound, soft, electrical, like something was still drawing power. Tucked behind a row of metal shelves was an old breaker box, rusted at the edges, with one tiny red light still flickering on a small adjacent device mounted beside it, a device that shouldn't have been there, because no one, not even Marlene, had ever seen it before. And as the electricians arrived to cut power and examine the unit, the truth slowly surfaced. The room beneath the daycare had once been used by the home's original owner for something more than storage, and this device, still faintly warm to the touch, was a part of an outdated surveillance system. And when they opened the file cabinet recovered from the underground space, inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of children, none labeled, most aged and curling at the edges, but each one clearly taken decades ago. Most outside, some in backyards, others in playgrounds. And though none were inappropriate or violent, the collection was eerie in its precision, as though someone had spent years watching and cataloging from a distance. And while James stared at the photos, Shadow moved toward a nearby window, sitting beneath it, ears twitching toward the neighborhood outside. And that's when the most unexpected part of the story emerged. A woman named Elsie Chambers, now 89, had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years, and when interviewed, she spoke slowly, remembering a man named Frederick Bell, a quiet, a loner who used to own the property before it became a daycare, a man who rarely left his home but was often seen watching from his windows, who disappeared suddenly one spring and was never seen again. And at the time, no one looked too hard, assuming he had moved away or passed on elsewhere. And now, with the chamber below and the photos found, questions surfaced, not about crimes, for no victims had ever been reported, but about what exactly this man had been watching for, why he had built the chamber, how it had remained untouched for so long. And through it all, Shadow remained calm, resting now beneath the classroom window, his head low between his paws, as if he had found what he was meant to find. And yet James felt deep down that something was still missing, not a threat, but a truth, a final piece that hadn't yet surfaced. And as he scratched behind Shadow's ears, he whispered that they weren't done yet. Not until the full story came out, because the town deserved peace, the children above deserved safety, and somewhere the past was still waiting to be uncovered. And if you've made it this far, we'd love to know, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? Because stories like these travel far, and it's always the quietest voices and the softest paws that change everything. It was early Sunday morning when the breakthrough came, not through a police file or a database ping, but through a handwritten note dropped off at the station by a man in his 70s who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His jacket soaked from the rain, his voice trembling as he handed over an envelope and asked for Officer Fulton by name. And inside the envelope, folded neatly around a faded photograph, was a short message that read, "I think the girl in this photo is my sister." And when James opened it, he saw the same soft green eyes staring up from the picture as the ones staring across the desk from him, only younger, brighter, filled with a curiosity that seemed frozen in time. And the man introduced himself as Walter Pierce, a retired postman who had lived in Maple Glen his whole life but hadn't spoken of his younger sister, Lucy, in over 50 years, because no one ever asked. Because after she went missing at age 6 in the summer of 1972, the story had never made it to the news, never made it to the missing children's posters, because their father had told everyone she'd gone to live with their aunt in Ohio. And back then, you didn't question your father. Not when his voice filled the house like thunder and the belt hung always within reach. And it wasn't until years later, after their father died and their mother fell silent with dementia, that Walter began to question everything. And over time, he convinced himself that maybe he had dreamed it. Maybe Lucy had never existed, or maybe she had left on her own. But when he saw the photo on the local news, pulled from the old file cabinet in the chamber beneath the daycare, the floodgates opened, and the memories came back so vividly that he couldn't breathe. Lucy's laugh in the backyard, the way she held his hand when they crossed the street, the time she'd cried because she lost her favorite red hairband, and now here she was in a photo that someone had taken secretly, catalogued and hidden away for decades, and as Walter sat across from James, his hands shaking as he touched the picture like it might disappear if he blinked, Shadow entered the room quietly and padded over to him, resting his chin gently on Walter's knee in the way only a dog who understands sorrow can do. And Walter looked down, tears slipping freely now, whispering thank you to a dog who had pulled the past from beneath the floorboards and laid it at his feet, and the investigation shifted, no longer just about blueprints or sealed-off rooms, but about a little girl named Lucy Pierce, whose name had been scrubbed from records, whose presence had been erased from photo albums, but who had, for one brief moment in time, been loved by her older brother with all the fierceness a young boy could muster. Now James knew what had to be done, not for a case, not for closure, but for healing, and so they returned to the chamber, this time with Walter, who descended the ladder slowly, his breath shallow, his eyes wide as they scanned the room. And when he reached the bottom, he stood in silence, his gaze moving across the wallpaper, the tiny rocking horse, the shelves in the corner with a single cracked teacup resting on top. And slowly he moved toward the wall and placed his palm flat against it, as if trying to absorb the years. And then he whispered, barely audible, "I remember this wallpaper. She used to draw stars just like these," and James swallowed hard, standing a few steps back, while Shadow sat in the dirt watching the man like he understood the weight of what had been found, and Marlene, who had come along to offer support, stood with her hands clasped tightly at her waist, tears in her eyes as she looked around the space that had once sat beneath her feet for 10 years without her knowing, and they all stood there, in that stillness, honoring the presence of a child who may have lived her final days in silence, yet had not been forgotten, not truly, not when her memory had stirred a retired canine into action, and later that day. As word spread and the town came together to repaint the classroom and donate toys and replace every mat with new ones, Shadow was honored at a small ceremony, not with medals or loud applause, but with gentle hands patting his back, children, hugging his neck, and Walter kneeling beside him with his forehead pressed to Shadow's, whispering again and again, "Thank you for bringing her back to me." Because sometimes closure isn't about arrests or headlines. It's about remembering, about restoring the truth where lies once lived, about letting the quietest voices finally be heard. And if you've ever had a dog who stayed close during your darkest hour, who knew when your heart was breaking even, when no one else did, then you know what Shadow gave to this family, to this town, and maybe to someone watching right now who needed to be reminded that even the smallest act, a scratch at the floor, a gentle stare, a quiet refusal to walk away, can unearth the deepest kind of love. And if this story moved you, if you're still here with us, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because your presence here means more than you know, and there's still one more chapter to tell, one final, the moment that brings it all together, and Shadow isn't quite done yet. It had been exactly 1 month since Shadow scratched through the floor of the daycare and turned an ordinary Tuesday into the kind of story people would tell for years. And the town of Maple Glen had slowly returned to its rhythm. The classrooms were bright again. The mats had been replaced, the bookshelves filled with new stories. And laughter had once again returned to the halls of Happy Steps Daycare. Not the same laughter, not untouched or unaware, but deeper now, wiser. It's the kind of joy that knows pain and still chooses to rise each morning. And in that time, Shadow had become something of a quiet legend in town, not in the way celebrities do, not loud or flashy, but in the way people speak of the sacred, the trusted, the miraculous. And it wasn't just the children who adored him now. It was the parents, the teachers, strangers, who'd only heard what he had uncovered. Because somehow, in just one act of quiet defiance, a scratch against the floor, he had brought back a name, a face, and a brother's belief in something he thought he'd imagined. And in the weeks that followed, James Fulton took Shadow on slow walks through the neighborhood, where people would stop and kneel. Some with treats, others just with tears, their hands trembling as they touched his fur like it held something. Holly and Walter Pierce, now walking taller, breathing fuller, began volunteering at the daycare every Wednesday, reading stories to children in the same room where Lucy's silence had once been buried. His voice steady as he turned each page, his eyes soft whenever he paused to look up and find Shadow lying quietly in the corner. Always watching, always listening, and no one had asked him to be there. Not officially, but he showed up anyway. And the children had grown used to his presence, often fighting to sit beside him during story time, and one day, when asked why he kept returning, he simply smiled and said, "Because I want to give back what was once taken away," and there was no need to say more, because everyone understood, and Marlene too had changed, though she didn't speak of it often. But those close to her noticed she started hugging the kids a little longer when their parents dropped them off. Started sitting a little quieter when the room was full of laughter, like she didn't want to miss a moment ever again. When asked what she remembered most about that day, she didn't talk about the hatch or the photos or the police lights. She talked about Shadow, how he didn't bark or growl or chase or drag anyone, how he simply stood his ground, scratched gently, then waited, like he was giving the world a chance to listen before it made a mistake. And that kind of stillness, that kind of loyalty, had changed her. And then, on a golden morning in early autumn, the town held a ceremony at the local park, not with ribbons or sirens, but with stories and songs, where each person who had been touched by Shadow, from officers to parents to children, stood and spoke about the moment they realized what he had done. And when it came time for James to speak, he didn't stand behind the podium. He simply knelt beside Shadow now, resting peacefully beneath the old oak tree, and spoke from his heart, saying that Shadow had been his partner, his protector, his compass, but more than anything, his teacher. Because Shadow had taught him that not all heroes make noise, that sometimes the ones who save lives do so by sensing what no one else can. And as the wind stirred the leaves and the town listened in stillness, Shadow leaned his head gently into James's shoulder, not to pose, not for attention, but just because he could. And the moment settled over the park like a prayer, and in the weeks that followed, a mural was painted on the daycare's back wall, a soft, colorful image of Shadow, standing tall beside a child who was half in shadow, half in light, holding his paw, with stars drawn in chalk above them, and beneath it were the words, "Some." Stories are found by those who never stop listening. And people would stop to take photos, not for social media, but to remember, to hold on to the truth that had been buried, that had now been brought to light. And as time went on, as children grew and classrooms changed, Shadow grew older too. Slower, resting more often, but never losing that alert sparkle in his eyes. And even on his last day, years later, long after the headlines faded, when the town had moved on, and only those who had lived through it still remembered the story by heart, Shadow passed peacefully in his sleep, curled beside James's boots, his favorite toy by his side, and though no sirens blared, no headlines screamed his name, the town felt it, like a breeze through the branches of that old oak tree. People came quietly to lay flowers at the mural, children tracing the outline of his painted paw with their fingertips. And James, older now too, stood beneath it and whispered, "You found what no one else would have. You gave this town something we didn't know we were missing, the truth." And now, as we close this story, maybe it's not just about what Shadow uncovered. Maybe it's about what he reminded us of, that dogs don't need words to speak. They just need us to listen, to trust them, to follow when they lead us toward what's hidden beneath the surface. And if you have a dog in your life who watches, who waits for you, who senses your pain without being told, maybe this story is for you too. And if it touched you, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because stories like this travel farther than we think. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, another dog is, scratching at another floor, waiting for someone to notice. And listening, always listening for the truth beneath the noise.